Hello everyone and welcome to another application development with ASP.NET. This is episode 12 where Nelson will continue with our project management system that we are working on. In the previous video, Nelson had got a good bit of the pieces put into place as our framework for starting the actual application, the meat of the application, but there's still a little bit more to be done, correct Nelson?
Right, we still got to get an Hibernate set up. We need to get the AutoMapper set up. We need to get some other sort of hook stuff set up that we'll talk about later. We need to get NHaml set up and a CSS preprocessor set up, and we'll talk about that later as well.
Okay.
So yeah, the first thing is the last few between now and the last few videos, there's another minor release of NHibernate. So we just grabbed the latest binaries. So if you want to go ahead and grab those instead of using ones that you've used in the past, just go to NHibernate SourceForge page. Grab that. So I'm inside the lib folder of the solution, which we set up in the previous episode. I'm just going to add an NHibernate folder, drag over our PDBs and our DLLs. Grab our linfoo. And yeah, so that should be it as far as the assemblies we need. So I guess now we need to talk about which assemblies that we're going to be needing NHibernate in. And for the most part, I kind of want to abstract away NHibernate. Inside what I'm going to be calling an I-entity unit of work, which kind of follows the same sort of. I mean, it's kind of hard to explain. I don't know if we've talked about the unit of work pattern in the past.
I don't think so.
It's that's sort of how NHibernate sort of rationalizes with itself, because you have the session, the I session, which I'm sure most of you remember. And then you have, inside the sessions, you have transactions. And both sessions and transactions actually follow the unit of work pattern. You could consider either of them as a unit of work. I'm going to be referring to an Hibernate transaction as what I'm going to call an entity unit of work. And that's going to be an interface that we're going to use to interface with NHibernate's session object within the context of a transaction. So the I-entity unit of work is going to replace the I transaction of NHibernate, but instead of just not providing anything other than a commit and a rollback method, we're going to provide the wrappers around the I session methods, so like the get, store, query, delete. And then on top of that, now we need to abstract away the session. So I'm going to call that the I-entity unit of work provider, which is the interface that's responsible for instantiating the I unit of works and sort of managing them. And then on top of that, we need to abstract away the factory or the session factory, and that's going to be the I-entity unit of work provider factory. And I know some people are probably rolling their eyes at that, but it works in my head, so I guess we're just going to go with it for now.
Sweet, sounds good.
Alrighty, so I guess we could first just start stubbing out these interfaces because they're pretty straightforward. Unfortunately, I'm looking here at the project structure, and we do not have a base. We do have a base, it's just hidden. Okay, so now we have our services.abstract, and so we have our iDummy interface that we had in the previous episode where we used to test the IOC container. I'm going to go ahead and nuke that because we really no longer need it for anything. And then I'm going to go yank out his implementation, which is in the services, and then I'm going to go unregister him with the container. Okay, so the three interfaces we're going to be creating, and we're going to be creating them in the base. And if you remember, the purpose of the base class library is to expose the interface of the application to the domain and the query model. So the domain and the query model both will depend on the base, but they won't depend on each other.
Right.
If that sort of makes sense. And then the implementation of what's in the base of these interfaces is going to be inside the services. class library. So like I said, we'll start with the iEntity unit of work, which wraps a, it's not a class, it's an interface. This wraps the, it's funny because this wraps both the concept of a transaction and the concept of a session, in that its lifetime describes a transaction, but the methods that we will perform on it are going to be delegated to the session, and that'll make sense hopefully between now and when we get done implementing. Okay, so we have our basic methods that you've probably already seen elsewhere. I don't know if we've ever done this particular abstraction anywhere else. Bring in our iQueryable. Query. And we're not going to provide a commit or a rollback method. That's going to be inferred based off of whether or not the code that's using this is going to throw in a transaction. So I guess the question is how do we get access to this interface, and how do we define the code that could either complete or throw a transaction? And that's going to be with the iEntity unit of work provider, which is again the abstraction over the iSession. And so pretty much the only responsibility of this guy is going to be to provide a iEntity unit of work. But we want to kind of control the code that gets sent to the entity unit of work so that we can wrap it around in a try-catch block. And I'm going to start out with a method that's not going to make any sense, but after I implement these interfaces, I'm going to go show some example code using these interfaces without implementing it first to sort of show, the use case that we have. And there's two methods actually that we have to implement here. I'm just going to do one of them right now, and then we'll do the other one in a second here. Now we need the factory. And the factory, all he does is he is the wrapper around the session factory, so he just returns a new iEntity unit of work provider. So all he does is say iEntity unit of work provider, get unit of work provider, and so there we go. So to kind of show how this code might be used, I'm going to go into the index controller and just create a constructor and grab an iEntity unit of work provider. And I don't know, I'm just calling them entities or something. And then if I did have a method here, and I wanted to, for example, query some, or not query, but I wanted to insert some entities into the database, what I could do is I could do entities.begin and then pass in a lambda that takes in the unit of work. So at this point, I can now interact with the session inside this block of code. But because we're sending in a block of code into the iEntity unit of work provider, he can then wrap the code that we're sending in that try-catch. And that try-catch will be used to determine if the transaction should be committed or rolled back. So at this point, we have access to the unit of work, which is the variable that's passed into the action. And we can now do things like store and pass in a new entity. However, we do run into a problem. The issue is there's no way to return anything out of this action. There's no way to actually query over anything. Now we could use hoisting to do that, or to set this to an external variable outside the scope of the lambda, but that would be pretty gnarly and wouldn't be very readable. So instead, we're going to go ahead and add another begin method. And this begin method will return a t object, an arbitrary object. He'll still be called begin, but instead of taking action, he'll take a func of an identity unit of work, and then he'll return a t object, which I need to parameterize over here. There we go. I hate these letters so much. There we go. So now that we have two overloads, we now have another overload that if we return something, now this is the really cool thing that C# does for us. Right now we're using the void overload, but if we did want to query over the unit of work, if we wanted to say, for example, return, or not return, like var users equals this, and we could say from here, return unit of work dot query, I don't know, let's just query ints for now. And now C# in all its awesomeness uses its method resolution and type inference to determine that we are now returning an integer from this begin method, or iQueryable of an integer from this method. So now we have...
I was just going to ask, for readability's sake, were you wanting to do OUW for unit of work?
I was biting my tongue.
I'll just call him session.
How about giraffes? Okay. Okay, continue. I was just curious.
Yeah. Minor dyslexia. Sorry about that.
No, it's all good. It's all good.
And then, of course, ReSharper is telling us that we can make this immensely more readable. Obviously, for things that return nothing, we cannot use the, like, for example, a session dot actually store does return something, and that's just so I can get away with more one-liners. We'll get to that in a second. But what we can do is we can just go ahead and say this, and then session.query, and then pretend that integer is some sort of entity that's mapped within Hibernate. So then it just becomes a lot more readable. We now have this wrapped inside of a transaction, which NHibernate wants us to do for both queries and updates and inserts, and it's required for updates as well. And we don't have to deal with transactions. We don't have to do the using iTransaction, try catches, commits, rollbacks, or anything. That's all taken care of for us by this iEntity unit of work provider. And then again, having these two overloads allows us to either do this for things that return stuff, or we can just simply not return anything and just have a block inside here that does whatever it needs to if what we're doing is an operation and not a query. And those will be basically the two use cases. When we're inserting stuff or when we're querying stuff, I guess sometimes we could be querying stuff and inserting stuff at the same time, and that's the whole idea of a transaction. But yeah, does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so now we have to implement them, which is pretty straightforward. It's just going to be the basic and Hibernate stuff that we've already been working with. And the class library we're going to be implementing them as the honeycomb.services, which again is just a default implementation of all of the honeycomb.base. Technically, the services isn't really required. The only reason we have it is so that we can reuse the same implementations for platform agnostic code between both the console and the web app.
Mm-hmm.
Because otherwise, then we would have to provide implementation. We would either have to A, provide implementations in the base, or B, provide copies of implementations both in the console and the web app, which we don't want. So yeah. The easiest one to implement is probably the iUnit of Work Provider Factory, or iEntity Unit of Work Provider Factory. I could have probably named it something else, but I just really like this name.
Well, that's cool. I know you really wanted to see if you could use every letter in the alphabet.
Or every pattern in the Gang of Four.
There you go. All in one word.
Yeah. So yeah, get unit of work provider, which all he's going to do is this guy is going to, again, he's going to wrap our session factory. So this class, at this point, this class library requires a reference to NHibernate, and I'm going to try to be keeping references.
Hang on one sec, Nelson. We've got some Skype breakup taking place.
Hello?
Yeah, talk for just a second before you continue.
Am I here?
Yeah, Skype's just being a little funky. So how's the weather there anyways?
It rained today.
Okay.
That's
little
good
bit.
to know.
Is it cold?
No, it's warming up, unfortunately.
All right, he's back.
Okay. Continue.
All right. Okay, so this guy's going to, what was I talking about? References. We are going to be trying to keep the references as thin as possible. Just because, I mean, we could actually nuke a lot of these, but we'll talk about that later. So yeah, we're only going to be adding references to things as we need them because we want to force everybody to go through the abstractions that we've created, or at least make it clear to people that you should not be using NHibernate directly, you should be using our entity unit of work. So I'm going to go ahead and add a reference to the required libraries of NHibernate, which are in our lib folder, NHibernate, and these guys. Actually, we really don't need linfoo, because we only need that copied to the bin directory because it's loaded at runtime. So we don't need that there. So then we're going to create our session factory. Or we need to create our config object first. And then we need to tell configuration to configure. And I just realized something.
Yeah.
We need Fluent.
Oh.
Oh no.
Okay. Did we want to? Let's risk it.
Okay, I'll try. Actually, I should have probably checked this, but can't remember if Fluent is up to the latest version of NHibernate yet. Which would mean just that's something you have to deal with at some point. When you're using multiple libraries that have to intermingle between each other, I don't think it is. The issue is that Fluent NHibernate is built against an earlier version of NHibernate. We might be able to get away with it, but there's a chance that we'll need to recompile Fluent, which, again, isn't a waste of time because I've actually had to do this myself a few times over the past however long I've been either toying with Fluent or using it in production where the versions just don't match up, and you have to recompile it. Yeah. It's annoying. But we'll see what happens. If it blows up, then we need to recompile, which isn't a big deal. All right, sweet. So now we have Fluent. Our config object is not a configuration anymore. It's a Fluently configuration, or a Fluent configuration. Actually, I don't know what type this is. It's Fluently dot configure. So that's a Fluent configuration object. I'm just going to pass it into that. And so now our config is a Fluent configuration. And we're going to ignore, and then remember that the .configure, this will pull the configuration out of the web.config for NHibernate. And we're going to deal with actually adding mappings in a little bit. I know that's probably the most important thing, but there's a lot of code that we need to write to get the AutoMapper to work properly. So we'll deal with that later. So let's go ahead and build out our session factory. Or
Hang on.
our non_session factory. What just happened?
You hit, I think it's Control Escape and something else that brings the marker out. You should be good now.
Sweet. So, and then at this point we're going to return a new, and then now we have to implement the entity unit of work provider. And he's going to wrap a NHibernate iSession. Let's go ahead and create that class. And then he just takes in an iSession. And then he also implements the iEntity unit work provider. Those two methods. And then we're going to return a new entity unit of work provider with a session factory dot open session. All right. Actually, the next thing we need to do, or hold on, did I type that too fast? Anybody?
I'm able to follow you, but you're probably going to be losing people behind. Or leaving people behind, excuse me.
It was pretty close.
All right, well, here is the code.
Nicely done.
Yep, we're good.
We're good. We're good.
Okay. So that's where we opened the session. We have to, though, realize that, at some point we have to close the session. And to do that, we don't want to expose a close method because that's kind of tacky. We could use the iDisposable pattern, which is something that's pretty much built right into .NET. Well, it's not really built right into .NET. It's a convention. And so we'll just go ahead and implement that here, where the dispose method, all he's going to do is do session.close. And that's how this session is going to become closed. And whoever is using this this method is going to know by looking at the identity unit of work provider. Actually, no, not by reflection, so ignore me. We're going to have to deal with that manually with AutoFac, which we can. So
I have no idea what you just said.
I told you to ignore me.
All right, that's cool. I mean, what I got out of it was that it's tacky to do a close method, so we'll just do a dispose method that performs our close for us.
Right, and then he's going to be acknowledged by AutoFac. Who will call our dispose method when it needs to be.
Good thing we called it dispose and not close. That would have been tacky.
Well, we had to call it dispose. I don't think you've really gotten into garbage disposals. Awesome. That is awesome.
Sounds like a painful job, actually.
Yes, Mr. Auto. Anyways, yeah, the garbage collector and talking about the iDisposable.
No, yeah.
And I'm talking to Zach, of
Yeah.
course. It's just something that he hasn't. It's a convention. It's something that's provided for us. If we implement iDisposable, then we have a dispose method that's going to get called when this object is being disposed of.
I see.
All right, so, and then because these methods are going to be incredibly similar, so I'm going to go ahead and implement this one first, and then we're going to implement the second one in terms of this one.
Can't believe I said garbage disposal.
Zach, apparently you haven't got into a garbage disposal before. No, can't say they have.
Wow, it's been a long and painful day. Sorry, Nelson.
Alrighty. So, like I said, we're going to be wrapping the transaction code. I'm going to go ahead and rename that. What should I rename this to? Jason name?
I liked UOW, but would you...
You changed it over to session earlier.
That was a different one. That was the parameter of
Oh, yeah,
this.
that was OUW. Silly me.
I don't know. I'll just keep it like that.
Yeah, I didn't have a problem with it personally.
Just copy and paste it. Letters are too far apart.
And unmarked, which is a real pain.
Why don't you like that? Oh, right. Stupid. Oh, right. No? Yeah, we haven't implemented the final class. Sorry, my bad. I'm going to go ahead and implement that class. Yeah, sorry about that. We need the entity unit of work, the final class that actually does the stuff that we want it to. Work. And he's going to take in a nice session. And then, okay. So all we did was create a class that implements this interface. We created stubs for all the methods, and we're taking in an nice session, and we're setting it to an internal field. And then we're just going to delegate to the session for every one of these methods. And again, it isn't necessary that I return the entity here in the store, but like I said before, it does provide the opportunity to do some one-liners. So that's why I do it that way. Oh yeah, that just brought in Hibernate.link. Alrighty, so here's the implementation of our entity unit of work. So now what we can do is we can instantiate that class inside of our unit of work provider and pass it into the delegate that the caller passed in, passing in the session to him. And then if we get to this point, that means an exception was not thrown, so we can commit the transaction. Otherwise, we need to roll back the transaction. But we can go ahead and use this syntax, which I don't think we've discussed before. But this throw with semi right after it, all it does is immediately rethrows whatever exception that we're currently dealing with inside this catch. So this basically still allows the transaction to propagate throughout the call stack, but we get the opportunity to add the trans.rollback method call. And then now we just return result. And then, like I said before, we can implement this method in terms of the other method by just calling unit of work UOW, passing in session, and returning 0 or whatever arbitrary thing you want to. And of course, this conflicts with stuff because the session, terrible name. Okay, so this code it's kind of convoluted what it's doing. Are there any questions about what it's allowing us to
No, I'm
do?
actually with you so far.
Okay, so
All right, hang on 1 second. We've got another Skype moment. Actually, it's interesting that Skype's been acting like this tonight. But where were you going to take this next, Nelson?
well, we do need to go ahead and write the AutoMapper.
Okay, this is actually a perfect place to bring this video to close, and then we can do the AutoMapper in the next one. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Nelson just went away.
No, sounds good.
Okay, awesome. All right, well, with that, thank you very much. That wraps up this video.